Imagine this. You arrive home to discover your grandfather's lakeside cabin, the very one he constructed with his own hands back in 1956, is now inhabited by an unemployed 28-year-old and his girlfriend. They offer you a smirk from your own front porch, declaring, "Sorry, but this belongs to us now." The president of the HOA sold it to her son for a mere $24,000, citing unpaid dues that you never actually owed. My grandfather's Purple Heart photographs were in the dumpster, and his handcrafted furniture was gone. The aroma of their greasy takeout food wafted from his kitchen, while the coarse cardboard boxes containing 60 years of our family's memories sat getting soaked in the rain. When I contacted the police, they instructed me to vacate the premises. However, what this power-crazed HOA leader didn't realize was that my grandfather was an employee of the FBI for 35 years, and that the cabin was, in a technical sense, still federal property. What would you have done upon finding strangers residing in your family's cabin? I'm willing to bet that some of you have HOA horror stories of your own. Let me go back and explain how this entire nightmare began. 3 years ago, I came into possession of my grandfather's cabin through my mother's side of the family. Walter Kowalski was a Korean War veteran who returned home in 1953 and resolved that he was finished with people giving him orders. Consequently, he purchased 5 acres of immaculate lakefront land for $800 and proceeded to build his ideal cabin using nothing more than hand tools and sheer determination. The home was magical. You could still detect the scent of pine sap oozing from the logs he had felled himself. You could hear the quiet lapping of Mirror Lake against the dock he constructed and feel the smooth texture of the stones in the fireplace he had mortared by hand. It's likely worth around 400 grand today, but for me, it was priceless. The coarse surface of those hand-hewn logs recounted the tale of a man who had rightfully earned his sanctuary. Here is the detail that no one ever discusses. The cabin was technically situated within the limits of the Whispering Pines HOA, but it was built 40 years before the association came into being. When they officially formed in 1996, Grandpa's property was grandfathered in. It should have been untouchable. Then came Margaret Thornfield. And yes, that is her actual name, because this account is being made public. Envision your most dreadful imagining of an HOA president. She had flawlessly coiffed silver hair, a voice sharp enough to shatter glass, and the type of smile that prompted young children to seek refuge behind their mothers. She had been managing that HOA as her personal fiefdom for 12 years, and she followed a very particular predatory pattern. Margaret went after inherited properties, particularly those belonging to military families and anyone with a name that sounded foreign. The reason? We are frequently out of state, managing family crises, and lack the time to engage in protracted legal disputes. She was like a vulture circling over injured prey, only with more impeccable manicures. Her professional role was as a real estate agent. Unsurprisingly, the woman understood precisely how to exploit the system against families she deemed unworthy of her exclusive neighborhood. Her son, Bradley, was a mix of 30% criminal and 70% mama's boy. At 28 years old, he was jobless and still resided in his childhood bedroom, carrying a rap sheet that listed petty theft, drug possession, and witness intimidation. He was the sort of person who would borrow your lawn mower, sell it on Facebook Marketplace, and then appear at your door wondering why you were acting strangely about it. Margaret had been attempting to secure him his own residence for years, but who would lease to an individual whose most recent employment was described as freelance pharmaceutical distribution? The first hostile move against me occurred while I was in Ohio assisting my mother with her recovery from hip surgery. A certified letter was delivered to the cabin. You're familiar with that crisp, official sound as you tear open such envelopes. The stale smell of legal papers, mingled with Margaret's floral perfume, felt like a physical blow. Contained within was an invoice for $15,000 in retroactive landscaping assessments for work I had never authorized, never consented to, and, in truth, had never even witnessed. She insisted on payment within 30 days or threatened to place a lien on the property. 30 days for landscaping work that supposedly took place before I had even inherited the home. The acrid taste of my morning coffee became forever linked with the experience of reading her harassing correspondence. But Margaret was only getting warmed up. Every single day, I would discover fresh violation notices slipped under my door. Grass too high, a citation. Mailbox painted the incorrect shade of black, a citation. Suspicious activity late at night, a citation. The woman had seemingly designated herself as my personal surveillance detail, with a specific mission to find any reason the Kowalski property did not conform to community standards. She had even persuaded the local utility company to obstruct my driveway for emergency tree trimming, which, by sheer coincidence, always occurred whenever I had company, particularly my friends from the army who would arrive in their pickup trucks. Next, she turned to the neighbors. Margaret possessed a unique talent for setting people against one another. She would go door to door, clipboard in hand, soliciting signatures on complaints about the disruptive military veteran who was likely afflicted with PTSD and causing property values to plummet. The whispers began. The friendly greetings ceased, and I soon felt like an outsider in my own grandfather's neighborhood. Margaret was constructing her case step by step, citation by citation. She demonstrated patience, meticulousness, and complete ruthlessness. What I hadn't grasped was that she had been orchestrating this specific property seizure for a very long time. It had nothing to do with HOA regulations and everything to do with a 40-year-old grudge that was on the verge of erupting into the open. 3 weeks following that initial menacing letter, Margaret executed her subsequent move, and it was a formidable one. She filed a lien against my property for $23,000 in accumulated fees, fines, and interest, no longer $15,000, but now $23,000. Apparently, my lack of payment on the first fraudulent bill had activated penalty clauses that would make a loan shark blush. The legal documents were delivered on a Tuesday morning, and I will always remember the sound of the process server's boots crunching on my gravel driveway. Margaret had leveraged her contacts at the county clerk's office to hasten the entire affair. It seems that when you have been in the real estate business for 20 years, you know exactly whose palms to grease and which forms to submit in the correct sequence. But this is where the situation becomes truly sickening. She had arranged a sheriff's sale to take place in just 30 days. A sheriff's sale, as if I were some delinquent who had deserted the property. The woman was, in effect, attempting to steal my grandfather's cabin through legal trickery, and she was doing it with a smile. Now, I might have been born at night, but it certainly wasn't last night. I dedicated the following week to sifting through public records, and my discoveries made my blood boil. In the preceding 5 years, Margaret had orchestrated the sale of 3 HOA properties to her own relatives at questionably low prices. Her brother-in-law had acquired a lakefront parcel valued at $200,000 for only $60,000. Her nephew managed to get a corner property for half of its market-assessed value. The woman was operating the HOA like her private real estate conglomerate. So, I launched my first counterattack. I reached out to the State Real Estate Commission and filed a formal complaint, which included transaction records, HOA meeting minutes, and a detailed timeline that would bring a prosecutor to tears of joy. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to describe the situation. This was outright corruption. The complaint detailed specific infractions, failing to disclose a financial interest in HOA matters, leveraging inside information for personal enrichment, and manipulating property values via selective rule enforcement. I felt like David preparing his slingshot, but Margaret didn't achieve her status as HOA queen by backing down when challenged. Within 48 hours of my complaint being registered, she convened an emergency HOA board meeting and, somehow, advanced my sheriff's sale to just 2 weeks away. 2 weeks? Her rationale was that I was deliberately undermining property values with my frivolous legal complaints and represented an imminent danger to the community's stability. The scent of her panic was nearly as potent as her perfume. She realized I was aware of her plot and was fast-tracking her timeline before I could mount an adequate defense. It was like observing someone attempting to rob a bank after the alarm had already been triggered. She mobilized the HOA board, all 4 of them, which included her hairdresser and the man who operated the local bait shop, to endorse emergency measures against the disruptive military veteran, who was obviously unstable and likely dangerous. The minutes from that meeting read like dialogue from a poorly written soap opera. Here is something that most people are unaware of. HOA liens can be imposed only after a formal hearing, during which the homeowner is given the right to contest the charges. Margaret had bypassed this step completely, wagering that I would be ignorant of my rights or lack the means to fight back. Always insist on proof of correct legal procedure before you acknowledge any lien notice. In the meantime, I was uncovering more about Margaret's operation than I ever wished to know. She had a comprehensive system in place. Identify inherited properties, especially those belonging to out-of-state heirs, inundate them with violations and fees, and then seize the opportunity when they were unable to resist. She had performed this maneuver before and was highly proficient at it. The truly disturbing part was that she had been monitoring my grandfather's property for years, simply waiting for him to pass away so she could execute her plan. Neighbors later informed me that she had actually inquired about his health during HOA meetings, as if she were monitoring a stock price. But Margaret had made one critical error. She presumed I was just another overwhelmed heir who would crumble under duress. She failed to do her research on whom she was truly up against. My grandfather wasn't just any veteran. He was the type of man who taught me that when someone attempts to steal from you, you don't simply surrender and accept it. I used that week to prepare for battle. Every document was duplicated, every talk was recorded, and every neighbor was interviewed. If Margaret wished to play rough, I was on the verge of showing her what a genuine fight entailed. The gravel of my driveway would soon be crunching under the boots of individuals she definitely did not want to encounter. Because this is the thing about military families, we don't just support each other. We possess long memories, influential friends, and absolutely no tolerance for bullies who believe they can overpower us with paperwork and legal intimidation. Margaret was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 2 weeks later, Margaret executed what I can only characterize as the most audacious theft I have ever seen. The sheriff's sale was set for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, but here is the catch. She ensured that only her associates were aware of it. You see, legal notices are required to be published in the local newspaper for public notification. Margaret's version appeared in the classifieds of some minor weekly publication that no one reads, positioned between advertisements for used farm machinery and a psychic hotline. The notice was so deeply hidden you would need a treasure map to locate it. Her inner circle, however, knew the exact time and place. At 9:58 a.m., I observed from across the road as precisely 3 individuals arrived for my public auction: Margaret herself, a man in a cheap suit who reeked of cigarettes and failure, and Bradley, who looked as if he had just woken up. The bidding was a farce. The man in the cheap suit started at $20,000. Margaret's little prince responded with $24,000, a suspiciously exact figure, as though he had calculated it in advance. Then, there was nothing but silence. The auctioneer glanced around for about 30 seconds before proclaiming Bradley the proud new proprietor of my family's cabin. $24,000 for a property valued at $400,000. It was akin to witnessing someone purchase a Lamborghini for the cost of a used bicycle. Within the hour, Bradley and his girlfriend, a charming woman with facial tattoos and a voice like a rusty chainsaw, were bringing their possessions into my cabin. I'm talking about trash bags filled with clothes, a collection of energy drink cans large enough to fill a recycling bin, and what looked to be a stolen shopping cart that they were using as a makeshift furniture dolly. It was at that moment I realized I required serious legal representation. I retained Rebecca Martinez, a lawyer specializing in HOA law who was known for eating corrupt board members for breakfast. Her initial action was brilliant. She found that the sale notice had not been published in accordance with state law. As it happens, there are very precise regulations for sheriff sale notifications. They must be printed in the newspaper with the largest circulation in the county, not some obscure weekly that Margaret's cousin likely owns. The entire sale was therefore legally void. Rebecca filed for an emergency injunction to halt any eviction proceedings. And for a period of about 24 hours, I believed we had Margaret cornered. That was when she revealed what she considered her definitive proof. A manila envelope was delivered by courier, because Margaret apparently watches an excess of legal dramas, containing a document that made my heart plummet. It was an HOA agreement dated 1987, bearing what seemed to be my grandfather's signature, consenting to full adherence to all current and future HOA rules and fee assessments. 1987 to 31 years after Grandpa built the cabin and supposedly 24 years before his death. The document appeared authentic, featuring a notary seal and all. Margaret had somehow manufactured evidence that my grandfather had willingly joined her HOA. The judge glanced at that document and issued a temporary restraining order against me. I was legally barred from getting near my own property while the court looked into the conflicting accounts. Bradley waved to me from my grandfather's porch, holding a beer in one hand and extending a middle finger with the other. Document authentication is more complex than one might think. Even notarized documents can be fraudulent if the notary did not correctly confirm the signer's identity or if the signer was under duress. Always insist on original documents and check notary credentials via the state's official database. But something about that 1987 agreement felt more suspicious than last week's salmon. To begin with, my grandfather was the most anti-establishment individual I had ever known. The man who preferred to live off-grid rather than contend with utility companies was going to voluntarily enroll in HOA harassment? Unlikely. Furthermore, the paper seemed too pristine for a 30-year-old document. No yellowing, no creases, no coffee stains. My grandfather was incapable of signing his name without spilling something on the paper first. It was a unique talent he possessed. I began phoning every neighbor who had known Grandpa, inquiring about 1987. What I learned was compelling. No one recalled him ever participating in HOA meetings, receiving violation notices, or paying any dues. For a man who had purportedly joined their association, he had been remarkably absent. Margaret, in the meantime, was practically taking victory laps around the neighborhood. She would drive by the cabin at a slow pace, windows down, that look of satisfaction plastered on her face as if she had just won the lottery. Her son was occupying my family's home, and there was absolutely nothing I could legally do about it. But Margaret had made a crucial mistake. She had become overconfident, and overconfident people make errors. She was unaware that I had begun recording every conversation, documenting every interaction, and constructing a case that would make her regret ever hearing the name Kowalski. The true battle was just commencing. Margaret's subsequent action was so despicable it made her prior maneuvers seem like gentle jokes. She chose to go for the jugular and attempt to ruin my reputation within the community. Within a week of the restraining order being issued, she filed not just one, not two, but 5 separate police reports alleging that I was stalking her family. According to Margaret's imaginative narrative, I was hiding around her house at night, tailing her to the grocery store, and making menacing gestures whenever she passed the cabin. The woman had evidently missed her true calling as a screenwriter, because these tales were pure fiction. But here lies the sick brilliance of her plan. She understood that veterans are often stereotyped with the unstable PTSD label, and she was playing that card like a seasoned poker player. She even succeeded in obtaining a restraining order that forbade me from coming within 500 feet of the cabin. 500 feet. I was unable to even drive past my own family's property without the risk of being arrested. The gossip around town grew louder. Did you hear about that military fellow? Margaret says he's been making threats. Perhaps we should be concerned for our safety. It was character assassination, plain and simple, and it was effective. But the community organizing game can be played by two. I arranged an informal gathering at Murphy's Diner, the kind of small-town establishment where the coffee tastes like it was brewed during the Clinton administration, but the pie more than compensates for it. I reasoned that if I was going to restore my good name, I had to do it in person with actual people. What I learned that evening altered the entire situation. Margaret's reign of terror was not confined to me alone, for other families shared similar horror stories. The Hendersons lost their deck due to structural violations that mysteriously surfaced after they complained about Margaret's landscaping decisions. The Patels were slapped with thousands in fines for cultural decorations inconsistent with community standards. In other words, the beautiful prayer flags in their garden. Then there was old Mr. Peterson, whose offense was installing a wheelchair ramp for his wife without obtaining HOA approval. Margaret had actually tried to compel an 80-year-old man to dismantle accessibility equipment. The stench of her moral decay was more potent than Murphy's overcooked hash browns. But the most significant revelation came from an unforeseen source. Someone passed me an envelope as I was leaving the diner. There was no signature, only a note that read, "You might find this of interest." Inside was a copy of Bradley's probation documents, which indicated that he was obligated to maintain a registered address with his probation officer. Can you guess which address Bradley had registered? His mother's house, not my grandfather's cabin. By taking up residence at the property, he had breached the terms of his probation, and his probation officer was completely unaware of his actual whereabouts. The kid wasn't merely a squatter. He was now a fugitive from the law. I contacted Bradley's probation officer the following morning, and let me assure you, Officer Williams was not happy to discover that his parolee had gone AWOL. Apparently, Bradley had failed to appear for his last 2 check-ins, stating he was house-sitting for a sick family member. Technically accurate if one considers theft a form of house-sitting. Restraining orders founded on false reports are surprisingly frequent. The positive side is that filing a false police report is a felony, and courts detest being misled. Document everything with timestamps and witness accounts. False accusers often get caught in their own contradictions. But Margaret was not finished with her character assassination tour. She began visiting local businesses, warning them about the dangerous veteran who was evidently experiencing a mental breakdown. She informed the owner of the hardware store that I had threatened to burn everything to the ground. She alerted the gas station attendant that I might be armed and unstable. The remarkable thing was observing her carry out these character assassinations. She possessed a manner of lowering her voice and glancing over her shoulder as if she were imparting state secrets. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but she would begin before launching into another imaginative version of reality. Meanwhile, I was creating my own network. Every veteran within a 50-mile radius started to hear about Margaret's methods. And let me tell you, we look after our own. When the news spread that some HOA queen was attempting to steal a Korean War veteran's property and slander his grandson, phones began to ring. The American Legion post commander, a Vietnam vet named Frank who could likely bench press a Buick, started making his own inquiries. The VFW Ladies Auxiliary, headed by a formidable woman named Betty who had completed 3 tours as an Army nurse, initiated their own background check on Margaret. And here is what they discovered. Margaret's father had lost a property argument to my grandfather in the 80s. All at once, her fixation on my family's land became perfectly clear. This was not about HOA rules or community standards. This was about a 40-year-old grudge that had been festering like an infected wound. Margaret believed she was contending with a single, isolated veteran. She was about to find out she had declared war on an entire brotherhood. While sifting through my grandfather's possessions, which Bradley had so generously discarded in the dumpster, I discovered something that altered the entire situation. Tucked away in a water-damaged cardboard box, beneath his Purple Heart citation and some old fishing licenses, was a manila folder labeled Official Correspondence, FBI. My hands were literally trembling as I opened it. Inside, I found letters spanning from 1960 to 1995, all on official FBI letterhead and addressed to my grandfather. But these were not the type of FBI letters one might anticipate. They were letters of thanks, payment vouchers, and meeting agendas for something called the Civilian Asset Program. It turned out that my quiet grandfather, who simply valued his privacy, had been serving as a civilian contractor for the FBI for 35 years. The cabin was more than just his retirement home. It had been utilized as an off-the-books meeting point for federal agents carrying out surveillance on organized crime figures who frequented the local casinos and hunting lodges. One particular letter, dated 1987, the very same year as Margaret's dubious HOA agreement, was especially noteworthy. It was from Special Agent Sarah Patterson, expressing gratitude to Walter for his continued provision of secure facilities and confirming that the property would retain its federal protection status for operational security reasons. Federal protection status. Those 3 words struck me like a bolt of lightning. I contacted the FBI field office in Detroit, half anticipating to be dismissed over the phone. But upon mentioning Agent Patterson's name and my grandfather's civilian contractor number, I was suddenly being connected to supervisory agents and requested to wait for verification. 20 minutes later, Agent Patterson herself called me. Although now retired, she remembered my grandfather with great affection. Walter was one of our most dependable assets, she stated. That cabin of his was ideal for our purposes, remote, secure, and entirely off the radar for everyone. Then came the revelation that brightened my day, my week, and likely my entire year. The property still holds an inactive federal easement for national security purposes. Has someone been meddling with federal property? A federal easement overrides local HOA authority in every instance. It's like bringing a tank to a knife fight. Agent Patterson clarified that while the easement was currently inactive, It had never been formally rescinded. The FBI held a legal interest in the property that took precedence over any local governing body, including the HOA. Margaret's whole legal approach, the liens, the sheriff's sale, all of it, was as legitimate as a $3 bill. But the truly satisfying part was about that 1987 HOA agreement Margaret was so proud of. The same year, the FBI had renewed its operational security arrangement with my grandfather. There was no conceivable way he would have voluntarily joined an HOA while hosting federal agents for classified briefings. Agent Patterson consented to meet with me the following day to examine the documents and evaluate any potential interference with federal interests. She also noted that the Bureau did not look kindly on individuals who harassed the families of their civilian assets, particularly when those families were military veterans. I spent that evening poring over 35 years of letters between my grandfather and the FBI, and a portrait of a man I had never truly known began to form. He wasn't just a veteran seeking solitude. He was someone who had kept serving his country in secret, offering a safe location for federal agents when they needed it most. The cabin had been far more than a family getaway. It had been a part of American intelligence history, and Margaret had been attempting to steal it so her deadbeat son could have a place to smoke marijuana and play video games. The next day, Agent Patterson would officially verify what I already suspected. Margaret had chosen the wrong property and the wrong family to contend with. The federal government was about to join the conversation, and HOA Karens do not generally fare well against the FBI. The next morning, Agent Patterson pulled up to Murphy's Diner in a black SUV that likely cost more than most people's homes. She was precisely what you would picture a 30-year FBI veteran to be. Sharp suit, even sharper eyes, and a presence that caused every conversation in the diner to instantly hush to a whisper. Over coffee that could probably strip paint, I laid out my grandfather's papers while she examined everything with the methodical precision of someone who had built a career on paying attention to details. "Your grandfather was a patriot," she remarked, looking at a 1982 surveillance report. "We utilized his cabin for operations targeting the Torino crime family. Some very dangerous individuals never realized how close we were to them." She made a phone call that took exactly 3 minutes, and upon hanging up, she wore the satisfied expression of someone who had just set a very powerful apparatus in motion. "The Bureau is officially reactivating its interest in this property. We will be launching a full investigation into any interference with federal assets." My first ally was secured, but I needed additional support. Rebecca Martinez, my HOA lawyer, was already formulating a legal strategy. She had identified 17 procedural errors in Margaret's lien process, ranging from improper notification to fraudulent documentation. But Rebecca's true brilliance was in recognizing the pattern. "Margaret has done this before," she explained, arranging property records across her conference table. "She goes after inherited properties, swamps them with violations, and then either compels a sale or acquires them herself through shell companies. It's a systematic scheme." Rebecca had pinpointed 6 properties over the last decade where Margaret had employed similar tactics. The total worth was over $2 million in real estate that had been transferred under questionable conditions. We were no longer just fighting for my cabin. We were uncovering a criminal operation. Our third ally emerged from an unexpected place. Daniel Kim, an investigative journalist for the regional newspaper, had been discreetly documenting HOA corruption throughout the state. When he learned of a case that involved FBI property, he practically salivated with enthusiasm. "This is the story I've been waiting for," he said, his notebook rapidly filling with information. "HOA corruption, plus federal property, plus harassment of a military family. This has Pulitzer potential." Daniel provided something we desperately required, a media strategy. He would liaise with local news outlets to guarantee maximum exposure when we made our move. Margaret's weapon of choice was public perception. We were about to use it against her. But our most formidable allies were the neighbors Margaret had been intimidating for years. Frank from the American Legion arranged what he termed a reconnaissance meeting at the VFW Hall. 23 families attended, each with their own tale of horror about Margaret's tyrannical rule. Public records requests are your greatest asset. HOAs are required to reveal all financial dealings. The Henderson family presented receipts demonstrating they had paid over $8,000 in baseless fines. The Patels had evidence of Margaret's discriminatory enforcement. Their cultural decorations were cited for violations, while identical items in other yards were ignored. Old Mr. Peterson had photographs of Margaret literally measuring his wheelchair ramp with a ruler, searching for infractions. But the most valuable discovery came from Betty, the VFW auxiliary president, who had conducted her own investigation. She had submitted a public records request for all HOA financial transactions from the past 5 years. What she uncovered was elegant in its simplicity. Margaret had been systematically embezzling funds. The HOA's landscaping budget revealed payments to Thornfield Property Services, a company owned by Margaret's brother. Security system upgrades were billed to Bradley's Electronics, a business that existed solely on paper. Even the legal fees were inflated, with Margaret charging the HOA for personal attorney consultations. Security cameras on your own property are legal in all 50 states, irrespective of HOA rules. Our strategy took shape on 3 fronts: legal, federal, and public relations. Rebecca would manage the courts, disputing every element of Margaret's property seizure. Agent Patterson would oversee the FBI investigation into the interference with federal property. Daniel would document the entire process for maximum media effect. Meanwhile, I had been discreetly setting up security cameras around the property's perimeter, which was perfectly permissible on federal easement land. Every violation notice Margaret posted, every instance of vandalism by Bradley, and every visit from her supporters was now being recorded in high definition. Federal property easements can be looked up through the Bureau of Land Management database. The genius of our plan was its straightforwardness. Margaret had constructed her power on secrecy, intimidation, and legal obfuscation. We were on the verge of bringing everything into the open. Every counterfeit document, every embezzled dollar, and every abuse of authority would be revealed for the entire community to witness. Agent Patterson conducted background checks on Margaret and Bradley that uncovered federal tax liens, undeclared income, and Bradley's probation violations. Rebecca assembled evidence of systemic HOA fraud that would make any prosecutor's eyes gleam. Daniel put together media kits that would transform Margaret from a neighborhood tyrant into public enemy number 1. Margaret believed she was fighting a single, isolated veteran. She was about to confront the collective power of the FBI, federal courts, and an entire community that was tired of her bullying. The hunter was on the verge of becoming the hunted. Margaret's desperation was becoming apparent, and desperate individuals do foolish things. Within a week of Agent Patterson's visit to the diner, Margaret retained a private investigator to find compromising information about me. Not just any PI. She hired Rex Bulldozer Korvinsky, a bottom-of-the-barrel operator who specialized in insurance fraud cases and likely learned his investigative methods from watching old episodes of Magnum. PI Rex was as refined as a sledgehammer in a glassware shop. Neighbors began phoning to inform me about a man in a worn-out Camaro who was inquiring about my mental state and history of violence. He would park outside Murphy's Diner with a telephoto lens, snapping pictures of me drinking coffee as if I were orchestrating international terrorism. The scent of his desperation was more potent than the cigarettes he chain-smoked during his surveillance. This was Margaret's brilliant plan. Hire a cut-rate detective to confirm that the dangerous veteran was, in fact, dangerous. It would have been amusing if it weren't so pitiable. But Margaret's true masterpiece was her attempt to bribe the county clerk to backdate some HOA formation documents. She needed to establish that her association had authority over my property prior to 1956, which was about as probable as discovering unicorns in the courthouse parking lot. The clerk, to his credit, recorded the entire exchange and delivered it to the district attorney's office. Margaret had proposed $5,000 for him to find some misplaced paperwork that would bolster her case. The recording was perfectly clear, including Margaret's voice stating, "This little problem could just disappear if you knew where to look." Meanwhile, the FBI investigation was gaining momentum in ways that made my week considerably better. Agent Patterson had tasked a junior agent named Martinez, no relation to my attorney, with examining all federal property records in the county. Their findings were intriguing. Margaret had been methodically researching federal properties for years, searching for inactive easements she could contest. She had targeted 3 other properties with federal links, but retreated when the owners hired expensive attorneys. My grandfather's cabin was a different case because she presumed a deceased veteran's grandson wouldn't be aware of federal protections. A mistaken assumption, Margaret. But the true bombshell arrived when Agent Patterson called with news that made my entire month. The FBI had found that Margaret and Bradley were not just illegally occupying my cabin. They were using it as a headquarters for Bradley's revived drug distribution operation. Surveillance cameras had recorded numerous suspicious deals, and Bradley's clientele included several individuals on federal watch lists. Federal marshals are not to be trifled with. When they deliver legal documents, local law enforcement must yield. Federal jurisdiction takes precedence over everything. Margaret's reaction to the federal investigation was to escalate her irrational behavior. She convened an emergency HOA meeting to retroactively amend the bylaws, hoping to invent new rules that could somehow supersede federal law. It was like watching someone attempt to repeal gravity by a neighborhood vote. The meeting took place in Margaret's living room, as the community center had mysteriously become unavailable. All 4 board members were present: Margaret herself, her hairdresser Linda, bait shop owner Dave, and Margaret's own brother-in-law, Tom. This was the formidable HOA board that was meant to nullify federal property rights. They voted unanimously, a real shocker, to enact emergency powers that would permit the president to override any federal claims on neighborhood properties. They also granted themselves retroactive immunity from any frivolous lawsuits filed by disgruntled former residents. The minutes from this meeting read like a comedic sketch written by people who had never heard of constitutional law. But Margaret saved her finest move for last. She convened a press conference, and I use that term very loosely, to declare that the neighborhood was being intimidated by a mentally unstable veteran who claimed to be an FBI agent. She arranged folding chairs in her driveway and invited local media to listen to her version of events. 3 people attended: a reporter from the Weekly Shopper newspaper, someone who might have been her cousin with a camera phone, and Daniel Kim, who was present to document Margaret's public implosion for his investigative series. Margaret's performance was spectacularly awful. She asserted that I was involved in a deep state conspiracy to seize neighborhood properties using fraudulent federal claims. She presented photocopied documents that supposedly proved my grandfather was a communist sympathizer who had infiltrated the FBI. She even implied that Agent Patterson was my secret girlfriend who was aiding me in committing fraud. The entire spectacle was recorded on video, including the part where Margaret noticed Daniel Kim filming everything and demanded he cease recording because she hadn't granted permission, on a public street, at her own press conference. Never underestimate the memory of a federal agency. They maintain detailed records that go back decades. By the conclusion of that week, Margaret had succeeded in creating a federal case file of bribery, facilitation of drug activity, and defamation. She had transformed from a local HOA tyrant into a multi-jurisdictional criminal defendant in record time. Margaret's final desperate act was so deranged that it made her previous actions seem like mild neighborly disputes. She initiated a full-blown smear campaign that would have impressed a political strategist, complete with anonymous flyers and a social media offensive intended to portray me as a dangerous, unstable veteran who was a threat to the entire community. The flyers began appearing on car windshields throughout the neighborhood, displaying my military photograph alongside headlines such as "Dangerous Veteran Threatens Neighbors" and "Is Your Family Safe?" She had somehow acquired my service record and distorted every commendation into proof of my violent inclinations. My Bronze Star became evidence that I was trained to kill, and my deployment to Afghanistan was presented as proof that I suffered from unresolved trauma. But Margaret's crowning achievement was the creation of a Facebook page titled Whispering Pine Safety Alert, where she posted daily updates on my supposed threatening conduct. According to her creative fiction, I had been stalking children at the bus stop, making menacing gestures at elderly residents, and engaging in suspicious nighttime activities consistent with terrorist surveillance. The comments section was pure gold, consisting mostly of Margaret responding to her own posts using fake profiles with names like Concerned Mother and Worried Grandpa. She had apparently forgotten that IP addresses can be traced and that Daniel Kim was taking screenshots of every single post for his investigation. Meanwhile, my actual support network was constructing a counter-narrative that Margaret had certainly not anticipated. Agent Patterson had put me in touch with the FBI's Media Relations Department, which released an official statement confirming my grandfather's service as a civilian contractor and the ongoing federal interest in the property. The statement was diplomatic but utterly devastating. The FBI takes seriously any interference with properties that have served national security interests, and we are actively investigating claims of harassment against the families of our civilian assets. In other words, Margaret had started a fight with the federal government, and they were not amused. Daniel Kim's investigation was evolving into the type of exposé that earns journalism awards. He had traced Margaret's pattern of targeting properties back 15 years, uncovered financial discrepancies in 6 different HOAs, and found links to a wider network of real estate fraud that extended across 3 counties. But the true breakthrough occurred when one of Margaret's earlier victims contacted Daniel after seeing his initial reports. Mrs. Chun, an elderly widow whose family had lost their property to Margaret's scheme 5 years prior, had maintained meticulous records of every interaction, every threat, and every legal tactic. I knew this day would arrive. Mrs. Chun told me over tea that tasted like justice and smelled of vindication. Margaret destroys families, but she always targets the wrong person eventually. I'm just glad it's you who will bring her down. Mrs. Chin's evidence included recorded phone calls in which Margaret explicitly detailed her strategy of targeting foreigners and military personnel because they don't know how to fight back properly. She had kept copies of forged documents, fraudulent assessments, and even photographs of Margaret's son vandalizing properties to create opportunities for violations. Personal vendettas in HOA leadership are more common than you might imagine. That's why many states now mandate that HOA board members disclose any conflicts of interest. The personal vendetta angle became perfectly clear when Mrs. Chun presented property records from 1983. Margaret's father, Harold Thornfield, had attempted to purchase my grandfather's lakefront property for a fraction of its true value, asserting it was landlocked and lacked lake access. My grandfather had not only declined to sell, but had also assisted the county survey department in proving that Harold's own property lines were incorrectly drawn, which cost him 20 feet of shoreline. Harold Thornfield had spent the remainder of his life harboring that grudge and had apparently passed it down to his daughter like a toxic family legacy. Margaret's entire plot was not about HOA regulations or community standards. It was about settling a 40-year-old score that had been festering in her family for decades. But Margaret's gravest error was underestimating the thoroughness with which I had been documenting everything. My security cameras had captured Bradley dealing drugs from my grandfather's front porch, Margaret coaching witnesses before they gave police statements, and even Rex, the PI, planting evidence in my trash for him to discover during his investigation. The footage was so sharp you could read the serial numbers on the pills Bradley was distributing. Agent Patterson nearly choked on her coffee when I presented her with the video of Margaret's son operating a drive-through pharmaceutical business from federal property. Researching the local history of HOA leadership is crucial. Old grudges frequently motivate present-day harassment. By the end of that week, Margaret had succeeded in amassing a federal case file substantial enough to serve as a doorstop. Drug trafficking on federal property, obstruction of a federal investigation, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and defamation of a federal assets family member. The woman had essentially fast-tracked her way through the federal criminal statutes. The trap was laid, the evidence was conclusive, and Margaret was about to enter a courtroom where her family grudge would face federal justice. Justice has a peculiar way of accumulating compound interest, and Margaret's debt was about to be called in, with 40 years of accrued penalties. The town hall meeting that would signal the end of Margaret's reign of terror was not even intended to be about her. Mayor Davidson had scheduled it to discuss the budget for the annual 4th of July festival, but Margaret had insisted on speaking time to address what she termed the federal conspiracy threatening our community values. 237 people crowded into the community center that Thursday evening, the largest attendance in the town's history. News had circulated via social media, veteran networks, and old-fashioned rumor that something significant was about to happen. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation and the scent of burnt coffee from the ancient percolator someone had retrieved for the event. Margaret made a fashionably late entrance, flanked by her 4 remaining board members, who looked as though they would rather be anywhere else on the planet. She was dressed for combat in her most professional attire, carrying a briefcase likely filled with more counterfeit documents and practice talking points. But she had failed to see the black SUVs in the parking lot, the serious-looking individuals in suits dispersed throughout the audience, or the way Daniel Kim was set up with a perfect line of sight to the podium, his video camera recording. Mayor Davidson began the meeting with standard business, but Margaret promptly demanded to speak first. "Mr. Mayor, this community is being attacked by a dangerous individual who is using false federal claims to terrorize law-abiding families. The people have a right to know the truth." She walked to the podium as if she were receiving an award, that recognizable smirk on her face as she surveyed what she believed to be her domain. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are contending with an unstable veteran who has been making threats, filing frivolous lawsuits, and now purports to work for the FBI." The crowd murmured, but not with the support Margaret had anticipated. She continued, holding up enlarged photographs of my grandfather's letters. "These so-called FBI documents are blatant forgeries. Everyone is aware that Walter Kowalski was a communist sympathizer who likely sold secrets to our enemies." At that moment, Mrs. Chun rose from her seat in the back row. "Excuse me, but are you suggesting that a Purple Heart recipient who served this country in Korea was a traitor?" Her voice resonated across the room like a bell, and suddenly every veteran present was sitting up a little taller. Margaret's composure began to crack slightly. "I am saying that just because an individual claims military service does not place them above the law. This man's grandson is using emotional manipulation and fabricated federal connections to seize property that legally belongs to the Homeowners Association." "Actually," a voice interjected from the center of the room, "let me clarify something about those federal connections." Agent Patterson stood up, her FBI credentials plainly visible as she neared the podium. "I am Special Agent Sarah Patterson, and I worked with Walter Kowalski for 35 years. He was one of the most patriotic Americans I have ever known." The room fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that worn-out carpet. As Agent Patterson went on, "Mr. Kowalski's property maintains an active federal easement for national security purposes, which means this HOA has precisely zero authority over that land. Moreover, we have been investigating interference with federal property and have uncovered some very compelling evidence." Margaret's face turned from a confident pink to a panicked white. That's not possible. I have documentation proving." "You have forgeries," Agent Patterson cut in, her voice possessing the kind of authority that makes generals stand at attention. "We have had your supposed 1987 agreement examined by federal document specialists. The paper was manufactured in 2019, the ink is less than 6 months old, and the notary seal belongs to someone who passed away in 1995. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Margaret physically stepped back from the podium. But Agent Patterson was not done. "We have also found that your son has been using the illegally occupied property to distribute controlled substances, violating both his probation and federal drug trafficking laws. Bradley Thornfield was taken into custody this afternoon." That is when the federal marshals rose from their seats, dispersed throughout the crowd. Margaret looked around frantically, finally comprehending that she was cornered. "This is entrapment. This is a setup. You can't do this to me." "Ma'am," said the lead marshal, walking toward the podium with handcuffs, "you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, interference with federal property, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Margaret's remaining board members were discreetly making their way toward the exits, but Daniel Kim's camera captured it all. Her final words before being led away were, "This isn't finished. I'll sue all of you. I have connections." Public exposure frequently prompts law enforcement action that private complaints fail to achieve. The community broke out in applause as Margaret was led away. But the true victory began when Mayor Davidson declared that the city would be initiating a comprehensive investigation into HOA oversight and establishing new safeguards for residents. Frank from the American Legion stood up and articulated what everyone was thinking. "It's about damn time someone confronted these HOA bullies." Walter Kowalski would be proud. Within 24 hours of Margaret's arrest, I was back inside my grandfather's cabin, taking in the familiar scent of pine logs and lake air instead of the stale cigarette smoke that Bradley and his girlfriend had left. The very first thing I did was remove the cheap blackout curtains they had installed and allow the morning sun to pour across the hardwood floors my grandfather had laid with his own two hands. The federal marshals had been meticulous in their eviction of the squatters. Bradley's collection of energy drink cans, the stolen shopping cart, and what looked to be a small pharmacy's worth of pills were all collected as evidence. His girlfriend had left behind a stack of romance novels and what I can only describe as the world's most furious houseplant, which I chose to keep and try to revive. Even criminals, it seems, can earn a second chance. Apparently, Margaret's legal woes were only just starting. Federal prosecutors brought charges against her for fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and interference with government property. The State Real Estate Commission permanently took away her license, and the IRS launched an investigation into her undeclared income from various property dealings. She was facing 3 to 5 years in federal prison and restitution payments that would deplete her savings. Bradley received 6 months in county jail and 2 years of supervised probation, which included mandatory drug counseling and community service. His probation officer was not taking any risks this time. Weekly check-ins and random drug tests would keep him occupied for the foreseeable future. But the most significant victory was the effect on the community. Within a month, other HOA boards in the county had voluntarily amended their bylaws to incorporate homeowner protections and financial transparency rules. The state legislature, influenced by Daniel Kim's investigative series, introduced the Homeowner Protection Act, which would stop future Margaret Thornfields from intimidating families. I created the Walter Kowalski Memorial Fund using money from a settlement that the HOA's insurance company was keen to pay to prevent further legal battles. The fund offers legal support to military families dealing with HOA harassment and provides grants for veteran housing projects. It seemed like the ideal way to commemorate my grandfather's memory while making sure his story would benefit others. The cabin itself transformed into something my grandfather would have cherished, a meeting place for the community he had secretly served for so many years. Every month, we hold a veteran support group where coffee is abundant and war stories are shared alongside practical advice on navigating bureaucracy, PTSD, and the difficulties of civilian life. Agent Patterson, now officially retired, became a frequent guest. She would bring FBI colleagues who were curious about the cabin's past, and we would sit on the dock as she shared tales about the operations that had been devised in my grandfather's living room. "This place helped keep America safe," she would remark, watching the sunset reflect off Mirror Lake. "Your grandfather was a true patriot." The annual lakefront cleanup, arranged by our new coalition of neighbors, turned into the largest community event of the year. Last year, we removed 3 tons of trash from the lake and nearby woods with volunteers who ranged from elementary school children to World War II veterans. Mrs. Chun provided homemade dumplings. Frank managed the logistics with military efficiency, and even Mayor Davidson rolled up his sleeves to contribute. Daniel Kim's investigation earned a regional journalism award and resulted in a book deal for a thorough examination of HOA corruption nationwide. He devoted a chapter to my grandfather's story, describing it as a perfect illustration of how federal service goes beyond the uniform and continues to safeguard American families decades later. The property dispute brought to light something wonderful about small-town America. When decent people unite against bullies, justice typically prevails. Margaret had relied on our isolation, our lack of knowledge, and our unwillingness to fight back. She hadn't anticipated the connections that bind military families, the long memory of federal agencies, or the strength of neighbors who refuse to let someone be overpowered. As I write this, I am sitting on my grandfather's handcrafted dock, observing the morning mist rise from Mirror Lake. The coffee tastes better here than anywhere else on Earth. The quiet is profound enough for clear thought, and every sunset serves as a reminder that some things are truly worth fighting for.